My definition of a real intellectual is someone who actually thinks for himself or herself, someone who is mostly interested in the truth and looks for it, who loves ideas for their own sake, not because they are part of their identity. There still are intellectuals like this. Even in universities, they are, and outside, they certainly are, but they're in a distinct minority.
Welcome to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods, a podcast at the nexus of hospitality, business, culture, and the mind. Now here's your host, Woolco Foods CEO, Stephen Toberoff.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. I am your host, Stephen Toberoff, and today I'm delighted to have someone as a guest that's explored so many subjects that I find fascinating and beyond fascinating, incredibly important in so many ways in society today. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Professor Gary Saul Morson. Professor Morson is the Lawrence B. Dumas Professor of the Arts and Humanities at Northwestern University, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has received Best Book Awards from the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and Eastern European Languages and from the American Comparative Literature Association. Professor Morson has won numerous teaching awards, and his class introducing the Russian novel has long been the most popular course at Northwestern and the best enrolled course in Russian literature in the nation. In recent years, he has also become known for defending the humanities in various public contexts. Professor Morson, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you.
So, Professor, I want to begin because what led me to reach out to you was your wonderful essay in the Wall Street Journal entitled Leo Tolstoy's Search for the Meaning of Life. And in this essay, you write, and I want to quote you here, having accepted the scientific worldview in place of religious faith, he turned to it for answers only to realize it couldn't address questions of meaning. His ideas were, quote, very useful for intellectual purposes, but for life they yielded nothing, and Levin felt suddenly like a man who has changed his fur cloak for a thin muslin garment, and going for the first time into the frost, he is immediately convinced, not by reason, but by his whole nature, that he is as good as naked, and that he must inevitably perish miserably. So my first question, Professor, is, do you believe that Levin comes to this faith through a form of an epiphany, or do you believe that he comes to it through the intellectual rigors that he's been subjecting himself to, trying to figure things out? Is it some combination of the two? How would you characterize his coming to this realization?
Well, he's driven to it by the sense that he has, the obsessive feeling that of his mortality, his brother has died, so he's thinking about that, and that everything he does, no matter how much he accomplishes, it will all disappear. And he has this deep sense of how absurd all that is, and doesn't know why one should do any effort at all. And this feeling utterly possesses him. Death makes everything meaningless. And it's by going through this experience that he eventually finds faith. But you have to go through it in order to do that. Intellectual arguments by themselves won't ever do that.
The reason that I ask and started in this way is because, for me, one of the fascinating dynamics or components of Anna Karenina is the juxtaposition of Levin to Anna, because in many ways, Anna's such a complicated character, Levin perhaps less so. But as I think about Levin and his coming to faith, one of the lines that really struck me, and I'm going to quote again, is that it was impossible not to care for those dependent on him, as to fling down a child one is carrying in his arms. This made me immediately think of Anna and what she does vis-a-vis her son, and then emotionally, one could say, for her daughter. Would you say that Tolstoy's inviting us to directly think of Anna in him using that description, which I think he uses more than once? And if so, for what ends? I would like to explore with you a little bit that juxtaposition. We have Levin, then we have Anna. How would you characterize that particular sentence, and do you think it's meant to lead us to Anna and begin questioning her journey?
Well, one of the ways in which realist novels of this period work was by having 2 or 3 plots, or 2 major and 1 minor plot within the covers, and the same covers, and it's thought that they intersect. I mean, or barely. Levin meets Anna late in the book, and it doesn't do very much. It's not very important. So the question then is, why put them together? Now, of course, Levin and Anna don't know their character in the novel, so it's not something they reflect about, but it's something that the author is inviting us to reflect about. What is the difference? Why put them together? What light do they shed on each other? So, yeah, one difference really is that for Anna, her sense of what is important in life makes children really secondary and leads her, to abandon her son and neglect her daughter, whom she has with her, but still neglect, because what's really important to her in life is being a romantic heroine. She's believed, as Tolstoy did not, right? The whole myth of, love as grand romance, that like Romeo and Juliet, that it comes down, that it happens to you, that you lose your will, that it's almost a religious experience, that it takes you beyond good and evil. That myth of romance, which we still have, if anything, even more strongly, that's what Tolstoy set out to show what was wrong with it. That's not how Levin thinks. Levin is something which is very rare. He's someone who really tries to find out the answer to things by experience and thinking them through. He's the very opposite of those people who just say, well, everybody in my circle thinks this way, so I think this way too. He's always changing his mind, which, proper people don't do. They all know what their political and social opinion is supposed to be, and they don't change. He's always changing his mind about that and everything else. And so he wants a sense of meaning which answers to specific experience. And what he finds eventually is that the meaning of things has to lie not in some grand philosophical scheme or grand romantic image, nothing transcendent, but in the ordinary day-to-day life experiences. If meaning isn't going to be there, it isn't going to be in any deep, reliable sense. And that's what he finally discovers.
That's such a powerful insight. And I have to say, listening to some other interviews you've given and reading your wonderful book on Anna Karenina really enhanced my appreciation of the novel, because I thought of it in ways that I had not before. But as I was listening to you and you're mentioning how Levin is struggling with these issues and thinking, I would say that the impetus of his struggle and his thinking comes from a place of wanting to do good, wanting to be better. Taking sort of a leap with what you're saying about Anna and the romanticism and this misguided adventurism and sort of excitement that we attach to romanticism, I would love to get your thoughts on something Dostoevsky wrote in his writer's diary, which I have a copy of, and you wrote such a great introduction to. But there's 2 things that Dostoevsky has written about this novel that really struck me that I really want to get your thoughts on. So as it pertains to Anna, he writes, but later at the end of the novel, we have a gloomy and terrible picture of the full degeneration of a human spirit. This we follow step by step through the depiction of that compelling state in which evil, having taken possession of a human being, trammels his every movement and paralyzes every effort towards resistance, every thought, every wish to struggle with the darkness that falls upon the soul. So it seems to me that Dostoevsky is almost describing it as if what occurs to Anna and her behavior is out of her control. Would you agree with my interpretation? And what are your thoughts on that? Because that would somehow absolve Anna of culpability in a sense.
Does it say that? I mean, does it exclude the possibility that the evil comes as the consequence of her action? I know in other passages he thinks really that it's the consequence of her actions that produces.
Even more importantly, with respect to Anna, like, for example, I think about Anna and the irony that she's the one who encourages Dolly to stay with Stepan. And in that scene with Dolly, she's almost a different person. Are we to perceive Anna as someone who is carried away by this sort of, for lack of a better phrase, evil inclination? Or is she just truly a person who's making decisions that are selfish, not concerning about other people, and she's fully responsible for the decisions she's making, that she's not really been under the spell of anything. What would you say to that?
Well, one way I like to think of Anna is, although she doesn't reason philosophically a lot, she's one of the great philosophical heroes of Russian literature. She lives and deeply believes the ideology of the romantic worldview and romantic love. And that leads her to, actions which come off as selfish, that is, to consider that neglect her child and things like that. But she's not thinking of them as selfish. She's thinking of them the way anyone who is devoted to, an ideal view of life, a utopian view of life maybe thinks. It doesn't feel selfish. It is selfish, but it doesn't feel selfish. It feels like devotion to what is truly important in the world, as opposed to, the trivial life that other people live. That's how she sees it. And that's how many people see life in the romantic way. They think really everyday life is just boring. It's only when you fall in love with some deep transcendent sense, not the sort of ordinary everyday love of a family, but the love that takes you out of the everyday, and it's practically a religious experience, a world well lost for love, that kind of thing. That's, a lot of people really believe that. I know some of my students have believed it until they read this book and they say, that's only one kind of love. There are other kinds of love. There's a love which values intimacy, not mystery, that subsides in the everyday, not the transcendent. And so the whole novel, you can take her as honestly devoted to the wrong way of thinking. And that's what leads to the evil.
It's clear from my reading that Tolstoy is making a value judgment, I think, and that Levin's love is certainly more appropriate. At the same time, it is quite fascinating, and I'm sure this was the case, and is the case even to this day, that so many people read this novel and miss the meaning and still view Anna as a heroine, ironically.
Yeah, it really is interesting. The majority of people who read this novel read it as celebrating romantic love. If you read it closely, there are so many passages where Tolstoy explicitly said, she's lying. This is wrong, right? In my book, I quote many of them. You think it would be impossible to miss. So why do so many people miss it, including very intelligent people? I think the answer is that the myth of romantic love as the only kind of love, as what life is all about, is so pervasive in our culture that readers can't imagine that Tolstoy would not be endorsing it. They think the only alternative to it is a boring bourgeois life, which is nothing but, accumulating money or something like that. And that if you don't do that, love has to be romantic. And that everybody thinks that. So they can't imagine that Tolstoy would think that Anna has the wrong view, and that, say, Dolly, who's not a very exciting person, but is the locus of moral value in the book. They can't imagine that's possible. And they rewrite the novel in their head so that it's Anna's story as Anna would tell it, okay? Rather than Anna's story as Tolstoy is actually telling it.
That's so true. Continuing with Anna Karenina, there was another passage in Dostoevsky's essay review on it that jumped out at me that I had to get your thoughts on. And this is at the end of the essay, and he's talking about Levin and his faith. I'm going to quote here. It's a sentence and then another sentence, which is the end of the essay. So Dostoevsky writes, and he, Levin, he's referring to Levin, and he will destroy his faith again, destroy it himself. It will not last long. There will be some new hitch, and everything will collapse at once. And then the last sentence of the essay is, not more than an hour had passed since the acquisition of faith, and again raspberries started being cooked over a candle. And I was very struck by that because I came away with the impression that Levin's faith, although something he was going to work on, was something he actually had a very mature understanding of. Like even very early on, he recognized that the mundane aspects of life would interfere. But I would love to get your thoughts as to Am I reading Dostoevsky correctly in his interpretation being pessimistic? And what are your thoughts about that? Why would he write that if, in fact, that is the case?
See, Dali has the right view of life, that it's about the everyday and beautifying and sanctifying the everyday. Levin has to reason his way to it, struggle for it. Tolstoy describes at one point how he got the ideas to this book. And he was looking at, some, I forget, doilies, napkins that had been carefully embroidered to make them look better. And he thinks that's how the women, the right kind of women, understand life. They take the everyday and try to make it beautiful because they understand that's where life really is. Men don't get that, not nearly as easily. Well, Dali really gets that. Levin arrives at it, but it's not natural to him. And so when he finds the truth, it's going to be unstable. He's going to lose it again and have to get back to it again. And because that's just the way it is. It's not essential to his nature the way it is for Dali.
Then that makes perfect sense. And I even think, as I said, Levin showed attention and awareness to that early on. So I thank you for clearing that up for me. Since we're on Dostoevsky, I want to continue this exploration of faith and go to an essay that you had written in First Things called Faith and Russian Literature. And one of the things that I've always struggled with, and your essay helped illuminate things for me because I love the novel Crime and Punishment. And one of the things about it that's so perplexing is, to me, even reading it, Raskolnikov has so many attributes that make him a sensitive, likable, compassionate, concerned, almost ethical individual, and yet he does these monstrous things. And I could never sort of understand that. But I want to read your quote, which helped explain it, and then ask you a question. So in the essay, Faith in Russian Literature, you write, quote, "To escape his horror at immorality, Raskolnikov entertains complete amorality, as if he could assure himself that he need not worry about evil because it is only a social construct. And what if I am wrong, he asks? What if man is not really a scoundrel? Then all the rest is prejudice, simply artificial terrors, and there are no barriers, and it's all as it should be, because there is no ought, only is." And so my question, Professor, is that the paradox of Raskolnikov, that he's such a deeply sensitive person that cannot handle the immorality of the world, that it drives him to make these unbelievable steps?
I mean, that's at the core of him. I know people who will, from philosophical reasons, will say, well, morality is a social construct, and it's not real. And then they feel okay if they do something wrong, because there's nothing really wrong. It's just a convention, right? I know people like that, and I would guess that if you went to academic literature or philosophy departments, you'd get a lot of people who thought like that, maybe most of them. That's a complacent way of arriving at it. Raskolnikov is completely different. He is so sensitive to human suffering. It hurts him so much. And you can tell from that dream he has when he was a boy, and he sees cruelty to an animal, how much it affects him. And it's not just in the way he tells it. He's so sensitive to the suffering of animals and people and the poor and the victimized that it's beyond. He's also conscious that he can't do anything about it, that he's totally powerless, right? And so he has to escape from seeing evil, wanting to do something about it, and being able to do absolutely nothing because he has no money, nothing, right? Can't help his sister, can't help his mother who is suffering. And so he adopts philosophies. And ironically enough, one way he escapes from the torment of human suffering and evil is by adopting that philosophy that says, well, it's only a social convention. Or another one, when he says it's all as it should be, so that's not the same philosophy, it's another one he jumps to, which is there's only laws of nature. If I dropped my pen, it would fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second square, according to the law of gravity. If you ask, is that moral or immoral would be a ridiculous question. The laws of nature just are. You can't attract moral value to them. But if you're a materialist and you believe that people are nothing but complex matter, then there's no good and evil there either. We're just governed by the same laws of nature. There maybe is a social convention that's useful, but there's no, in itself, good and evil. So that's another way Raskolnikov can escape. Well, it just has to be this way. There's no alternative, so don't fret about it. He is going to fret about it. But both of these ways, complete relativism or complete determinism, are ways in which this incredibly sensitive person escapes from that sensitivity combined with powerlessness.
Well, this, of course, leads me to a question that scholars have been discussing for a long time, and since I have you, I really want to get your thought on it, which is the ending of Crime and Punishment, and really trying to understand where Raskolnikov is after having committed the murders and gone through what he's gone through. And so I'll just read a quick quote from the ending, which is, quote, "However, that evening he was unable to think for long or continuously about anything, or to focus on some thought. In fact, now he was not deciding anything consciously. He was only feeling. Instead of the dialectic, life itself had arrived, and in his consciousness, something altogether different had to be worked out." And so my question for you, Professor, is, juxtaposing it to Levin, if we will, has Raskolnikov truly found sustainable faith at the end of Crime and Punishment, or is he still someone capable of doing monstrous acts because he's struggling with the issues that he'd been struggling with earlier in the novel?
Here's what's strange about that part of it's the epilogue to Crime and Punishment, right? All of the novel, up to the epilogue, is told with deep psychological realism, with all the conventions of the realist novel, and everything has to be plausible psychologically. And then in the epilogue, Dostoevsky switches to something completely, it's not realistic. It's mythic, it's timeless, and what converts it is a symbolic dream, not psychologically accurate, but symbolic, giving the truth, right, the way it might in a medieval conversion narrative, right? And so it's by that process that he arrives at faith. And since it's not narrated realistically the way Levin's conversion is, or the way the rest of Crime and Punishment is, you can't give an answer to your question, which is a question based on realism. You can do it with Levin, because it's told in psychological realism that Dostoevsky here has switched to myth, to something timeless. And, I personally think that was a mistake. A lot of people have thought that the epilogue didn't work very well. A lot do. I don't think it works as well as the rest of the novel, precisely for this reason. It's unsatisfying after all this time to have the conversion Dostoevsky is the greatest psychological realist who ever lived. So it's unsatisfying to have it done as if it were, a parable.
It's a very interesting answer. I wonder if he meant anything by using the epilogue as a device, or if it may have just been a mistake.
When I was much younger, half a century ago, I remember seeing a cartoon. I don't remember where. Maybe it was a New Yorker, but it was some sort of cartoon like that. And it had evidently an editor behind the desk and an author who was Dostoevsky in front of the desk. And the editor is saying to him, "Well, we like your novel, Crime and Punishment and Repentance, Mr. Dostoevsky, but you should cut it by about a third."
That's very funny. That makes all the sense.
And so he takes that third out and condenses it, well, I can't do the whole thing. I'll make it a little epilogue in mythic time. That's what it actually happened. It's just a cartoon, but it makes perfect sense to me,
That's very funny. That makes a lot of sense as well. So, in addition to your writings about faith and atheism in literature, you have many writings, and I've listened to discussions you've had on the consequences on humanity in the real world where atheism runs wild. And there was an essay you wrote called Among the Disbelievers in Commentary Magazine. And I want to, if we may, just transition now beyond literature and into this notion of atheism and how it plays out in the real world and its devastating consequences, or faith, if you will. So in your essay, Among the Disbelievers, you write, quote, Bolshevik ethics began and ended with atheism. Only someone who rejected all religious or quasi-religious morals could be a Bolshevik, because as Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and countless other Bolshevik leaders insisted, success for the party was the only standard of right and wrong. And so my question, Professor, excuse me if it's crass, but, did Lenin and Stalin, did they really believe this, or were they simply so concerned with keeping, maintaining, and growing power that they knew that people who were truly religious would never buy into this, and they had to crush that because it was an obstruction to their power? Or were they really so doctrinal that they believed that this was their doctrine and they were incapable of seeing what was in front of their face, which was the monstrous behavior?
Well, a lot of people have asked that question, and I think most people who have asked it professionally are themselves people who can't take ideology really seriously. It's just a theory. But Russian intellectuals do, right? And I don't think there's any question but that Lenin and I think Stalin really believed this ideology. And I know other people I've met, other professors who also believe it. The ideology can be very convenient. If I do something that fits my interest, Lenin would say the party's interest, it must be moral, because that is the only standard of morality, what's good for the Communist Party. And so you can't condemn it. So the monstrous evil you're talking about is only evil from the standpoint, of religious or bourgeois people who believe that there is a permanent abstract standard of good and evil by which the party can be judged. That is shown to be equally untrue, right? And partly it's the same reason we saw before. If you really are a materialist, where could moral standards come from that aren't relative to your, Lenin would say, because he's a Marxist, to your class interest? They can't come from anywhere. And so they're all a delusion, you understand? And that's why he feels that, Lenin even went a step further. It's not just that you can kill people for the good of the party. It's that if you don't, you're making a mistake. If there are two equally good ways of suppressing, opposition, you always choose the most brutal one. Why? Well, why not is the question. If you don't, it's because you believe in something like the sanctity of human life. But that's a religious notion. You have to get over that. That's, Lenin take the materialist worldview and the Marxist worldview, I think, further than anybody else had taken it, and shows really where its implications lie.
I would agree with you, but what's so fascinating and maddening is I recently read this biography on Lenin, by Victor Sebestyen, and the whole biography, or at least a good chunk of it, in my mind, served to humanize Lenin in that it shows him hiking in the mountains, it shows him going on vacations with Nadia, it shows him weeping over her. So this was not a man who was unaware of culture. You used the word in your answer, Professor, delusion. Would it be fair to say that there was just an immense self-delusion going on? Because one would have to, it would almost require a lack of intelligence to not see the base, how shall we put it, acquisitional drive for power behind all of this, not doctrine. Isn't that even where Marxism, Leninism may come from? That Lenin was thinking, we can't be too tethered to Marx in our pursuit of the objectives. So right there, is he not taken? I don't know if these people were masochists beyond imagination, but how could a cultured person who's hiking in the mountains truly justify to themselves the excess of cruelty and torture that they sanctioned and encouraged without massive self-delusion?
He would say that yours is self-delusion. You actually think, he would say, that there's some reason, God-given, who knows what, not to kill people if the interests of the party that will ultimately save all of humanity demands it. You're the one who is a romantic, deluded person, he would say. I think he's perfectly consistent in his beliefs that the way some other revolutionaries who thought, oh, yeah, no, we're atheists and we're ready to kill people, but we don't like to kill people. There were such. And Lenin would say, well, if you're atheist and you don't believe in the sanctity of the soul, why do you shun? They're not consistent, is what he would say. And I think he really is consistent in his belief. And he's willing to follow where the belief leads, in the way that, softer souls like the anarchist Kropotkin, who did steady kill people, but it's still as possible, right? They're not willing to be consistent. The way he sees, you have to think yourself into a worldview which is not ours at all, right? In which the individual human life doesn't matter at all. You have no soul, right? It's not anything. You have to think yourself into that. And then it's not cruelty. It's what history demands you do. You might as well argue against the law of gravity. I know it's hard for us to think, but I think that's what he really thinks about it.
So I understand what you're saying with Lenin, and I think certainly with Stalin, who I've read a lot about, it makes perfect sense. But then my next question that would spin from that is, how does a culture like Russia that produces a Tolstoy and a Dostoevsky, the millions and millions of people who participated in this behavior, all of them could not have been as doctrinally pure as Lenin. Most of them probably lacked the intellectual capacity to do it. So what gave them the impetus and the ability to either do any of the myriad of things, whether it was the torture rooms of the NKVD, the killing of the kulaks? Where did the masses of people derive their legitimacy for this behavior? Was it fear? Was it mass psychosis? How did that arise?
That's the question that shapes my latest book, that, Wonder Confronts Certainty. It's the Russian history is an argument between the radical intelligentsia, which is possessed by ideology, and the great writers who thought you couldn't reduce life to ideology. So on the one side, Russian tradition, they take it to the extreme. You have Lenin and Trotsky and Kropotkin and other such people. And on the other, you have Chekhov and Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And this continues into the Soviet period when the radical intelligentsia takes control. Then they become the government, but you have the great dissident writers who preserve the humanist tradition. And let me give you an example of something that we see around. I see people, intellectuals I know, nice, soft-hearted people, willing to sign petitions supporting Hamas. Do they really think that what happened on October 7th, rapes and mutilations is okay? They don't ask the question. They know what you sign on to a position as a package. And you're going to be whatever this package you want to call it. And all the beliefs that come with this package, you automatically accept because you've accepted the package. That's what the Russian intelligentsia was largely like. They lived a life with whatever was their idea. Some were anarchists, some were populists, some were Marxists, but with all of them, they bought the whole ideology wholesale, and there was no questioning anything that came with it. So they wouldn't have actually examined each proposition in separate. Just the way, today I know people who, if they have one progressive or conservative belief, you can guess all of their beliefs because they come as a package. They're not when beliefs, if they weren't come packaged, you'd mix them, right? It depends on the evidence for each one. But people are not doing that when they accept the whole package. And anyone who accepts a whole package can be led to do literally anything when that package suggests it, because they won't question it.
It's funny because your answer right there leads me to the exact next question that I had, which was a quote of yours that really hit me in the essay, again, Faith in Russian Literature, where you write, Dostoevsky also described this phenomenon common among intellectuals. They absorb a series of prescribed beliefs and over the years take them for granted. But those beliefs, to use Dostoevsky's words, resemble a uniform. In ages of prescribed opinion and in contexts where one never hears anything else, this phenomenon becomes almost universal. I think of this passage frequently when speaking with my college students. I want to ask, do you really believe what you're saying? Hasn't something been planted from outside? When did you consider counter-arguments? Are you even willing to hear them? But those very questions cannot be heard by intellectuals whose personal identities are bound up with the dogmas they embraced. But my question for you, Professor, is, where Dostoevsky's writing, he's saying things such as, in ages of prescribed opinions and in contexts where no one hears anything else. Well, in the United States of America, we don't live in that. There's a myriad of views and ideas all the time. How is it that the intellectuals can rationalize? In other words, how is it that happens in a country such as ours, where you do have all these opinions and information, that people will sign a petition in favor of Hamas? Or to speak on another subject that you've spoken on so eloquently, when during the episode we lived in 2020, the most unscientific statement I ever heard was uttered daily like a mantra: don't question the science, which is oxymoronic in itself. How do these ideas find themselves here in the United States, a culture 180 different degree than Russia in most respects?
If you look at it as a whole, it's 180 degrees from Russia. But if you look at the culture of intellectuals, they never hear views like the facts that you might find in a moderate or conservative report, opinions, arguments, they have never heard at all. So they live in a total bubble, okay? And I can't imagine anybody outside of not sharing their views unless they're somehow stupid, evil, or whatever. I can't imagine. So they make themselves a bubble. That's also, by the way, that was true of the 19th century Russian intelligentsia too, right? There was a lot of different opinion in Russia at the time. But the intelligentsia created this new culture of its own. And they couldn't even imagine an intelligent person thinking different. There was recently a survey, of students done by a Northwestern professor, if I'm not mistaken, of students on the Northwestern University of Michigan campuses. And in this survey, 88% of them said that they falsified their opinions. They pretend to be more progressive than they are because they're afraid of social ostracism if they don't. 88%. Which means, by the way, that the only ones who really believe this is now they're only 12%, and the others are pretending to. Right? It means there isn't that many who actually believe it. But you don't need that many when people buy their beliefs as a package and are afraid to say otherwise.
That makes perfect sense. So then would you say that we've identified that the problem resides amongst intellectuals who, among other attributes, I think we could say are closed-minded and arrogant, and they block information that challenges it, and perhaps they cling to their prestige. Would you then say, Professor, that it might be the challenge of our society to actually and actively try to delegitimize this prestige that envelops intellectuals? Because one, it's undeserved, and two, it's the prestige itself that enables 12% of the population to cow 88% into behaviors that are totally out of alignment with what they know is right, what they believe, what is common sense in many cases.
Well, it's a good question. But intellectuals, meaning highly educated people, don't have to be like that. They're not always like that. They weren't like that when I was growing up. There was some pressure, but there was a diversity of opinion. In early 20th century Britain, you could think anything. Most of the time, in most cultures, intellectuals, educated people have their opinion. It's an exceptional phenomenon when you have something that resembles 19th century Russian intelligentsia. That's what we're getting closer to now. But the solution is, not to delegitimize intellectual work or intellectual thought, but to delegitimize package thinking among intellectuals and get them to really be real intellectual. My definition of a real intellectual, is someone who actually thinks for himself or herself, right? Someone who is mostly interested in the truth and looks for it, right? Who loves ideas for their own sake, not because they are part of their identity. And there still are intellectuals like this, right? Even in universities, they are an outsider, certainly are. But they're in a distinct minority. I think the solution is to return to a situation which is a normal situation where, listen, a university is a place where what counts is how good your arguments are. So you argue, right? And you say, and it's a way of trying out ideas. And, it happens in the rest of the population, but it's supposed to happen in intellectuals in a university, that we can return to that. And I'm hoping that we do. But it's only a small minority now, a significant minority, but we're relatively small that are like that now.
Well, I'm optimistic at what you said. I did my undergraduate work at University of Chicago, and I remember my first year there when they had the Aims of Education address. It was delivered by a professor of philosophy named Ted Cohen. And I still remember the whole thrust of the speech is that regardless of whatever texts you engage in with Freud or Plato or whomever, respect the text, but never neglect to challenge things that don't make sense to you. Ask questions, think critically, listen to other people's opinions. And you said something, Professor, that I think is so important, and this may lie at the crux of it, where people convince themselves that they are their ideas, when in fact the ideas themselves are not who they are. The ideas are there if they can stand the test of reason and rationality. And if convincing evidence comes to replace it, and yet they attempted to collectively brainwash, manipulate, coerce this entire country of ours to think that if you think critically and you do your own research, you're the fool. So maybe that is the message, that really driving home, think critically. You are not your ideas.
At the time that you had that speech at the University of Chicago, which, has been the prime intellectual university where take ideas most seriously for their own sake, always. That's the University of Chicago ethos. I'm not sure even at the University of Chicago you'd get such a speech today. It would be certainly controversial if you did. But I think you put your finger on the key thing, that is, if you identify with your ideas, to be a member of my social group, I have to have these opinions, and I have these opinions, then you can't imagine not having the prescribed opinion, because it questions the very nature of who you are, or who you can associate with, and how you think of yourself. More importantly, if your whole life has been, thinking of people who challenge these sort of opinions as being bad people, if I challenge them, I become a bad person. Again, it's not just the social ostracism, it's the feeling of who you are yourself. When that happens, then you can't evaluate the arguments for an idea, the evidence for an idea, and listen critically. And that's the problem. You can't make your ideas part of your identity, or you can't really examine them honestly.
Professor, I just have one more question for you. Although I've enjoyed this conversation so much, I could continue for much, much longer. But my question is, because I have to ask you, why did Tolstoy name the novel Anna Karenina?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because after all, it's only half the novel. And in fact, he was at one point thinking of naming it 2 families. I would have said 3 families because there's really a third plot, the Dolly plot too. But I'm guessing that he calls it Anna Karenina because that's what Anna would call it. Okay? She thinks of the world as around herself. So it's kind of a hint of her narcissism. She really is a narcissist. You always find her looking in the mirror or dusting the bread, right? It's what she would call it. Now, that's why I'm guessing he calls it that. Levin wouldn't call it Consequential Levin.
No, he wouldn't call it Levin. No, that makes a lot of sense. That explains it. Professor, I've so enjoyed this discussion, and I want to end with a quote from your wonderful book, Anna Karenina in Our Time, where you write, "But I prefer to use the works to create a dialogue with the present." And I studied English in college many, many years ago, and I have to thank you because you really have enhanced my appreciation of Anna Karenina a great deal. That's the best of literary criticism, when it can enhance a work and really open it up to someone in ways that it wasn't before. So I thank you for doing that for me, Professor, and I greatly thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for listening to The Profitable Table, fed by Woolco Foods. Please be sure to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. And to learn more about Woolco Foods or Stephen Toberoff, please visit us at woolcofoods.net.